Hello there, and welcome back to another journey into the darker corners of history. Tonight, we're going to step into a world where glory came with a price so steep that most would never pay it willingly. A place where childhood ended before it truly began, where weakness meant death, and where the very society that created legends also created a living nightmare for those who lived it. We're talking about Sparta. Not the Hollywood version with perfect abs and dramatic speeches. Not the romanticized tale of 300 heroes standing against impossible odds. Tonight, we're going to peel back the bronze armor and the heroic myths to look at what it actually meant to be a Spartan warrior. And I promise you, it's nothing like what you've been told. Before we begin, I want you to get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights a bit. Let your mind settle into that quiet space where you can really listen. Because what we're about to explore isn't just ancient history. It's a window into one of humanity's most extreme experiments in social engineering. A society so focused on creating the perfect warrior that it forgot what it meant to be human. If this kind of deep dive into history's shadows is what you're looking for, I'd be grateful if you hit that subscribe button. It helps this channel reach other curious minds who want to understand not just what happened, but what it felt like to live through it. No pressure, of course, just an invitation to join a community that believes history is more than dates and battles. So settle back, maybe close your eyes if that helps you focus, and let's walk together into ancient Greece. Into a city-state where every single day was a test of survival. Where your worth was measured not by your thoughts or dreams, but by your ability to kill and die for the state. Where being born meant entering a machine designed to strip away everything soft, everything gentle, everything that makes life worth living. This is the story of what it really meant to be Spartan, and why, despite all the legends, it was one of the worst fates that could befall a human being in the ancient world. When most people think of ancient Greece, they picture philosophers debating in Athens, or perhaps the Olympics, with their celebration of human achievement. They think of democracy, art, literature, the birth of Western civilization, and all of that is true. But Greece was not a single place with a single culture. It was a collection of city-states, each with its own way of life, its own values, its own vision of what it meant to be human. And then there was Sparta. Sparta was different. So fundamentally, brutally different, that even other Greeks looked at it with a mixture of awe and horror. While Athens was creating philosophy and theatre, Sparta was creating something else entirely. A society where every institution, every law, every tradition existed for one purpose only: to produce warriors. Not just soldiers who could fight, but human beings who had been systematically transformed into instruments of war. The Spartans didn't stumble into this system by accident. They chose it, they designed it, and they maintained it for centuries, generation after generation, because they believed that anything less would mean their destruction. They lived in constant fear, you see. Fear of their neighbors, fear of rebellion, fear of showing any weakness that might invite conquest. So, they made a bargain with darkness itself. They would sacrifice their humanity to become something more than human on the battlefield and less than human everywhere else. To understand why it sucked to be a Spartan warrior, we need to start at the very beginning, not with battles or glory, but with birth. Because in Sparta, your fate was decided before you could even open your eyes. When a child was born in Sparta, there was no celebration, no gifts, no prayers for a long and happy life. Instead, there was an inspection. The baby would be examined by the elders, who would look for any sign of weakness, deformity, or imperfection. And if they found it, if the child failed this first test, the decision was swift and final. The infant would be taken to the slopes of Mount Taygetus and left to die. This wasn't considered cruel, it was considered necessary. In the Spartan mind, a weak child would grow into a weak adult, and weak adults were a threat to the state. They consumed resources without contributing. They diluted the gene pool. They introduced vulnerability into a system that demanded absolute strength. So they were eliminated, not out of hatred, but out of cold, calculating logic. If you were fortunate enough to survive this initial selection, if your body met the standards of Spartan perfection, you were allowed to live. But living in Sparta was not the same as living anywhere else in the ancient world. From your first breath, you belonged not to your parents, not to yourself, but to the state. You were property, a resource to be developed and deployed as the state saw fit. For the first 7 years, you lived with your mother. But even these early years were different in Sparta. While children in other Greek cities were coddled and protected, Spartan children were deliberately exposed to hardship. They were fed simple food, often insufficient food, to accustom them to hunger. They were given minimal clothing to make them tough against cold and heat. They were encouraged to fight with other children, not discouraged from violence but rewarded for it. Spartan mothers had a saying that reveals everything about this society's values. When they sent their sons off to battle, they would hand them their shield and say, "Come back with it, or on it. Come back victorious, or come back dead." There was no third option, no acceptable middle ground between triumph and death. But the real transformation began at age 7. That's when every Spartan boy was taken from his family and entered what was called the agoge. And this is where the true horror of Spartan society reveals itself. Because the agoge wasn't education as we understand it. It wasn't training as other militaries practiced it. It was a systematic program designed to break down everything natural and human about a child and rebuild them into something else entirely. The agoge lasted for 13 years. 13 years of deliberate brutalization, designed to eliminate weakness, empathy, individuality, and independent thought. Boys were placed in groups under the supervision of older youth, and from day one, they were taught that survival depended on absolute obedience to the state and absolute ruthlessness toward everyone else. They slept on beds made of reeds that they had to gather themselves from the river Eurotas. No mattresses, no blankets, no comfort. The beds were deliberately uncomfortable, designed to prevent deep sleep and keep the boys in a constant state of alertness. In winter, they were allowed to add thistles to their bedding, not for comfort, but because the prickly plants generated a small amount of warmth through the body's reaction to constant minor irritation. Food was scarce by design. The boys were given just enough to survive, but never enough to feel satisfied. They were expected to steal additional food, but if they were caught, they were brutally punished. Not for stealing, but for being caught. The lesson was clear. Take what you need, but be clever about it. Weakness would not be tolerated, but neither would stupidity. This created a constant state of hunger that served multiple purposes. It kept the boys lean and tough. It taught them to live on minimal resources, preparing them for military campaigns where food might be scarce. And most importantly, it created a competitive environment where boys learned to see each other as obstacles rather than friends. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. Compassion was a weakness that might get them killed. The physical training was relentless. From dawn to dusk, the boys practiced weapons handling, combat techniques, and military formations. They learned to fight with spear and shield, sword and dagger. They practiced until their hands bled, until their muscles screamed, until their bodies moved with deadly precision even when their minds were exhausted beyond thought. But the physical training was almost gentle compared to the psychological conditioning. The agoge was designed to eliminate everything that made these children human. They were taught to suppress emotions, to ignore pain, to view compassion as weakness and mercy as betrayal. They learned to see the world in stark terms: Spartan and enemy, strong and weak, useful and useless. They were encouraged to spy on each other, to report any sign of weakness or disloyalty. Friendship was discouraged because friends might hesitate to sacrifice each other when the state demanded it. Love was seen as a distraction that could compromise judgment in battle. Even the family bonds were systematically weakened, replaced by loyalty to the state and to their military unit. And through it all, they were watched. Constantly, carefully watched by older Spartans who had survived their own agog and who now served as instructors and evaluators. These men looked for signs of potential, but also for signs of weakness. Boys who showed too much individuality were broken down until they conformed. Boys who showed too much compassion were taught cruelty through direct experience. There was no escape from this system, no appeals to family, no refuge in privacy, no moment of genuine rest. Every day was a test, and failure meant punishment that could range from public humiliation to outright death. The boys learned quickly that their only chance of survival was to become exactly what the system wanted them to be: perfect killing machines with no will of their own. As they grew older, the training intensified. At 12, they were given only one cloak for the entire year, regardless of weather. They learned to march barefoot over rough terrain until their feet became as hard as leather. They practiced combat in all conditions: rain, snow, blazing heat, complete darkness. They were taught to sleep standing up, to remain alert for days without rest, to function effectively even when pushed beyond the normal limits of human endurance. The psychological pressure was equally intense. They were regularly beaten for minor infractions, not as punishment for wrongdoing, but as conditioning to accept pain without reaction. They learned to take blows without flinching, to endure torture without breaking, to watch others suffer without showing sympathy. Emotional responses were systematically trained out of them until they achieved a kind of inhuman calm that other Greeks found deeply disturbing. And perhaps most horrifically, they were taught to kill not just enemies in battle, but anyone the state designated as expendable. As part of their training, teenage Spartans were sent out on what were called cryptia, secret missions where they would hunt and murder helots, the enslaved people who worked Spartan lands. These weren't military operations against armed enemies. They were assassination missions against unarmed civilians whose only crime was being born into slavery. The purpose was twofold: to keep the helot population terrorized and compliant, and to give young Spartans experience in taking human life. They needed to learn that killing was not just acceptable, but necessary, that the value of human life was determined entirely by its usefulness to Sparta. A helot who worked hard was valuable and should be preserved. A helot who showed signs of rebellion was dangerous and should be eliminated. Personal feelings about the act of murder were irrelevant. This is what it meant to grow up Spartan. Not glorious training to become a hero, but systematic dehumanization designed to create perfect tools of state violence. By the time a boy completed the agog at age 20, he was no longer recognizable as the child who had entered it 13 years earlier. He had been hollowed out and refilled with only those qualities that served the Spartan war machine. But graduation from the agoge didn't mean the end of suffering. In many ways, it was just the beginning, because now these young men had to prove they were worthy of full Spartan citizenship. And that test would push them even further into a world where humanity was not just discouraged, but actively punished. The road to becoming a true Spartan warrior was paved with the bones of everything that might have made life worth living. And we're only getting started. By age 20, after 13 years in the agog, these young men faced what might seem like relief. They were done with the worst of their training. They had survived what killed or broke so many others. But freedom was an illusion in Sparta. What awaited them was not liberation, but a different kind of prison, one that would define every moment of their adult lives until the day they died. The first thing to understand about graduating from the agog is that it wasn't really graduation at all. It was more like being promoted from one level of hell to another. These young men, now 20 years old, were physically and mentally scarred in ways that would never fully heal. They had been systematically stripped of every normal human response. They couldn't form deep relationships because trust had been beaten out of them. They couldn't show affection because tenderness was weakness. They couldn't even enjoy simple pleasures, because pleasure was seen as a Sparta wasn't finished with them, not distraction from duty, but even close. From age 20 to 30, these men entered what was called actived in barracks with other soldiers, eating together, military service. For 10 full years they live, sleeping together, training together. They were not allowed to live with wives, even if they were married. They could not pursue personal interests or private careers. Their entire existence was communal and military, every waking moment dedicated to preparing for war or fighting in one. The barracks life was deliberately harsh. Imagine being 30 years old and still sleeping on a hard cot in a room with dozens of other men, eating the same terrible food you've been choking down since childhood, following the same rigid schedule that governed your life when you were 7. There was no privacy, no personal space, no moment when you could simply be alone with your thoughts. The food deserves special mention because it reveals so much about Spartan values. The main meal was a black broth made from pig's blood, vinegar and salt. It was famously awful. Even other Greeks who tasted it said they finally understood why Spartans were so eager to die in battle. Death would be preferable to eating that slop for the rest of their lives. But that was exactly the point. Spartans weren't supposed to enjoy food. Pleasure in eating might make them soft, might make them hesitate when military duty called them away from a comfortable meal. Everything in Spartan society was designed to eliminate comfort, pleasure, and individual desire. These men had no hobbies, no personal interests, no creative outlets. Art was discouraged unless it served military purposes. Music was allowed only if it inspired courage in battle or discipline in training. Literature was limited to martial poetry and stories of heroic death. Philosophy was viewed with suspicion because thinking too much might lead to questioning orders. The psychological toll was devastating. These men had been trained from childhood to suppress their emotions, to view compassion as weakness, to see other people primarily as tools or obstacles. But humans aren't meant to live that way. The emotional needs that had been beaten down in childhood didn't disappear. They festered. They created a kind of internal pressure that had no healthy outlet. Many Spartans developed what we might recognize today as severe psychological disorders. They became obsessed with death, not because they were brave, but because life had become unbearable. They sought out increasingly dangerous situations, not from heroism, but from a desperate need to feel something, anything, beyond the numbing emptiness that the agoge had created in their souls. The relationships between Spartan men were complex and deeply troubled. The system encouraged what it called mentorship between older and younger warriors, but these relationships were often abusive in ways that would horrify us today. Older men had complete authority over younger ones, and that authority extended to physical and sexual access. Young Spartans learned early that their bodies, like everything else about them, belonged to the state and could be used by their superiors however they saw fit. These weren't relationships based on affection or mutual respect. They were power structures designed to reinforce the absolute hierarchy that kept Spartan society functioning. Every Spartan learned to submit completely to those above them in rank, while exercising absolute authority over those below. It was a system of brutalization that flowed downward through every level of society. The treatment of helots reveals another layer of the horror. Helots were the enslaved people who did all the actual productive work in Spartan society. They farmed the land, built the buildings, crafted the tools and weapons. They vastly outnumbered the Spartans, which created a constant fear of rebellion. And this fear shaped every aspect of how Spartans treated them. Helots were subjected to systematic terrorism designed to keep them compliant. They were forced to wear dogskin caps and rough clothing to mark their status. They were beaten regularly, not for any specific offense, but simply to remind them of their place. During certain religious festivals, they were made drunk and then paraded before young Spartans as examples of how not to behave. The message was clear. This is what weakness looks like, and this is why weakness must be eliminated. But the most chilling aspect of helot treatment was the cryptia, which we touched on earlier. These were organized hunts where young Spartans would go out at night to kill helots who showed signs of intelligence, strength, or leadership potential. This wasn't warfare. It was cold-blooded murder designed to prevent any possibility of organized resistance. The psychological impact on the Spartans themselves was profound. They were being trained to see other human beings as animals to be culled when convenient. They learned that human life had no inherent value, only strategic worth. A helot who worked hard was useful and should be preserved. A helot who might inspire others to resist was dangerous and should be eliminated. Personal feelings about taking life were not just irrelevant, they were actively harmful to clear thinking. This conditioning extended to how Spartans viewed their own families. Marriage existed purely for reproduction. Spartan men were encouraged to lend their wives to other men if those men were considered genetically superior. Children were seen as future soldiers, not as sources of joy or love. Elderly parents were valued only for their wisdom about military matters. Anyone who became too old or sick to contribute to the war effort was quietly abandoned. The famous Spartan practice of exposing weak infants was just the beginning. Spartans who were injured in battle and could no longer fight effectively often faced a choice between suicide and social exile. There was no concept of honorable retirement, no recognition of past service, no care for veterans who had given everything to the state. Once you were no longer useful as a warrior, you were no longer truly Spartan. Women in Sparta faced their own particular hell, though it was disguised as privilege. Spartan women were given more physical freedom than women in other Greek cities. They could exercise, own property, and speak publicly. But this freedom existed solely to serve the state's need for strong mothers who could produce strong warriors. They were breeding stock, selected and managed for optimal reproductive output. Spartan mothers were expected to encourage their sons to die gloriously in battle, rather than live with any hint of cowardice. They were supposed to feel pride, not grief, when told their children had been killed fighting for Sparta. Those who showed too much maternal affection were seen as threats to the state's hold on the next generation. Love itself was viewed as a form of treason. The marriages were often arranged based on genetic considerations rather than compatibility or affection. Spartan women learned early that their primary value lay in their ability to produce healthy children who could survive the agorge. Their own desires, dreams, and individual personalities were secondary to their biological function. Even the famous physical fitness of Spartan women served the state's purposes. They exercised not for personal health or enjoyment, but to ensure they could bear strong children and survive the physical demands of pregnancy and childbirth. Their diet was regulated, their activities monitored, their entire lives structured around maximizing their reproductive potential. The social pressure on these women was enormous. They were constantly watched and judged by other Spartan women, all of whom had been conditioned to value state loyalty above personal bonds. Friendships between women were viewed with suspicion if they seemed too close, because personal loyalty might compete with loyalty to Sparta. Even mothers were encouraged to report their own daughters if those daughters showed signs of weakness or disloyalty. This is what daily life looked like for everyone in Sparta. Not the glorious existence of Hollywood films, but a grinding, relentless system of mutual surveillance and psychological pressure. Every conversation was potentially monitored. Every action was evaluated for its impact on military readiness. Every human relationship was subordinated to the state's need for perfect warriors. The economic system was designed to support this military focus, but it created its own forms of suffering. Spartans were forbidden from engaging in trade or commerce. They couldn't pursue wealth or material comfort. Their economy depended entirely on helot labor. which meant that every Spartan was complicit in a system of slavery so brutal that even other slave-owning societies found it excessive. This economic dependence created a terrible vulnerability. Spartans knew that their entire way of life depended on keeping hundreds of thousands of helots terrorized and compliant. They lived in constant fear of helot rebellion, which made them even more paranoid and violent. It was a vicious cycle where fear bred cruelty, and cruelty bred more fear. The intellectual poverty of Spartan society was another form of suffering. While other Greek cities were developing philosophy, mathematics, literature, and art, Spartans were forbidden from pursuing any knowledge that didn't directly serve military purposes. They remained deliberately ignorant of the wider world, cut off from the intellectual developments that were transforming human civilization. This wasn't accidental. Knowledge was dangerous because it might lead to questioning. If Spartans learned about other ways of living, they might begin to wonder whether their own system was necessary or desirable. So they were kept in a state of educated ignorance, knowing only what the state wanted them to know, thinking only what the state wanted them to think. The religious life of Sparta reflected these same oppressive values. Their gods were primarily war deities who demanded sacrifice and absolute obedience. Religious festivals often involved displays of military prowess or endurance rather than celebration and joy. Even their spiritual lives were militarized, offering no refuge from the demands of the warrior culture. Prayer in Sparta was less about seeking comfort or guidance, and more about requesting strength to kill enemies and die gloriously. Their temples were decorated with weapons rather than art. Their priests were former warriors who preached the virtues of sacrifice and the necessity of violence. There was no space in Spartan religion for peace, mercy, or forgiveness. By the time a Spartan warrior reached full adulthood at age 30, he had been so thoroughly conditioned by this system that he was barely recognizable as human in the way we understand the term. He had learned to suppress every natural emotional response. He viewed other people primarily as tools or threats. He had no conception of life's purpose beyond serving the state through violence. And yet, the system demanded even more from him. Because being a Spartan warrior wasn't just about individual conditioning. It was about participating in a collective machine of destruction that would define the next phase of his existence. The wars were coming, and everything he had endured so far was just preparation for the real horror that awaited him on the battlefield. The battlefield was where all of this conditioning was supposed to pay off, where the years of brutalization and dehumanization would transform into military glory. But the reality of warfare in ancient Greece was nothing like the heroic tales that have come down to us. For the individual Spartan warrior, battle was not an opportunity for personal heroism. It was a terrifying, chaotic nightmare where survival depended entirely on the man standing next to you, and where death could come from any direction at any moment. The famous phalanx formation that made Spartan armies so effective was both their greatest strength and their most psychologically devastating weakness. Picture it, hundreds of men packed so tightly together that they could barely move independently, each one carrying a heavy bronze shield on his left arm and a long spear in his right hand. The shields overlapped, creating a wall of bronze that could stop most projectiles. But this protection came at a terrible cost. In the phalanx, you were not an individual. You were a component in a machine, and if any component failed, the entire formation could collapse. Your shield protected not you, but the man to your right. Your life depended entirely on the man to your left, keeping his shield up and his position steady. There was no room for personal initiative, no space for individual courage or cowardice. You moved when the formation moved. You fought when the formation fought. You died when the formation died. The psychological pressure of phalanx warfare was enormous. You were pressed so close to other men that you could smell their fear, hear their labored breathing, feel their bodies trembling with exhaustion and terror. The noise was deafening, bronze clashing against bronze, men screaming in pain and fury, the wet sounds of spears piercing flesh. The smell was overwhelming. Blood, sweat, urine, and excrement as men lost control of their bodies in the extremity of combat. And through all of this chaos, you had to maintain perfect discipline. If you broke ranks, if you ran, if you even hesitated at the wrong moment, you could doom not just yourself, but every man around you. The Spartan training had prepared you for this by eliminating your ability to think for yourself. But it had also eliminated your ability to adapt to unexpected situations. You were a perfectly trained robot, but robots break when faced with circumstances they weren't programmed to handle. The weapons themselves were designed for maximum psychological impact as much as physical damage. The Spartan spear, or dory, was 8 to 10 feet long, tipped with a bronze point, designed to punch through armor and flesh with equal ease. But in the close quarters of phalanx combat, spears often broke or became entangled. When that happened, warriors had to draw their secondary weapons, short swords designed for close quarters butchery. Fighting with a sword in the crush of a phalanx was a nightmare beyond description. You couldn't swing properly because there was no room. Instead, you had to thrust and stab at whatever target presented itself, often unable to see exactly what or whom you were hitting. You might find yourself stabbing at a man's armpit, the only vulnerable spot you could reach. You might drive your blade into someone's groin, hearing them scream as they collapsed. You might feel your sword scrape against bone as it found its way between ribs to pierce a lung or heart. The bronze ply of Spartan armor cooled protection and prison. A full pano armor that Spartans wore was both that much bronze in the heat of weigh 60 pounds or more. Greek summer wearing was like being slowly cooked alive. Warriors would collapse from heat exhaustion even before the fighting began. The armor restricted movement, made breathing difficult, and created blind spots that enemies could exploit. But the armor also served a psychological function. It made you look less human, more like a machine of war. The bronze helmet, with its horsehair crest and narrow eye slits, turned your head into a frightening mask. You could barely see out of it, and your hearing was severely limited. The world became a narrow tunnel of bronze-filtered reality, where friends and enemies were distinguished mainly by which direction they were facing. The famous red cloaks that Spartans wore into battle weren't chosen for their dramatic appearance. They were red because red hides bloodstains. When you're fighting in close quarters with edged weapons, blood gets everywhere. It sprays from wounds, pools on the ground, soaks into clothing. The red cloaks meant that Spartan warriors could continue fighting even when they were covered in blood, because the stains wouldn't show. Their enemies would see what appeared to be fresh, uninjured men, even when those men were actually bleeding from multiple wounds. The physical toll of this kind of combat was devastating. Even if you survived a battle without serious wounds, your body would be battered and bruised from head to toe. The weight of the armor, the constant jarring impacts, the sheer physical effort of fighting for hours at a time left warriors barely able to move for days afterward. Many suffered permanent injuries, damaged joints from carrying heavy equipment, hearing loss from the constant noise of metal on metal, scars from minor wounds that never quite healed properly. But the psychological damage was even worse. Modern soldiers who experience combat often develop what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. They have nightmares, flashbacks, difficulty forming relationships, and problems controlling their emotions. Spartan warriors experienced all of this, but their society had no concept of psychological trauma. There was no treatment, no understanding, no sympathy for men who couldn't simply shake off the horrors they had witnessed and participated in. Instead, Spartans who showed signs of psychological distress were viewed as weak. They were expected to suppress their symptoms, to continue functioning as if nothing had happened. The very training that was supposed to prepare them for combat had eliminated their ability to process trauma in healthy ways. They couldn't talk about their experiences because that would be showing weakness. They couldn't seek comfort because comfort was forbidden. They couldn't even acknowledge their own pain, because pain was something to be endured silently. This created a spiral of psychological destruction. Warriors who had survived multiple battles often became increasingly detached from reality. They might continue to fight effectively, but they lost the ability to connect with other human beings in any meaningful way. They became walking ghosts, their bodies still functional, but their souls effectively dead. The famous Spartan phrase, "come back with your shield or on it," reveals the impossible psychological pressure these men faced. There were only two acceptable outcomes to any battle: victory or death. Survival with defeat was worse than death because it meant living with the knowledge that you had failed in your only purpose. Warriors who retreated, who showed cowardice, who survived battles that their comrades did not, faced social death even if they escaped physical death. This meant that many Spartan warriors actively sought death in battle, not from heroism, but from desperation. Death was preferable to living with the shame of survival. They would take unnecessary risks, volunteer for the most dangerous assignments, and fight with a recklessness that their enemies mistook for courage, but was actually a form of suicide. The logistics of ancient warfare added another layer of suffering. Armies had to carry all their supplies with them or forage from the countryside. Food was often scarce, water sometimes scarcer. Warriors might march for days on minimal rations, then fight a battle while weak from hunger and thirst. Diseases spread rapidly through camps where sanitation was primitive and medical knowledge limited. Wounds that might be easily treatable today were often death sentences in the ancient world. Even minor cuts could become infected without proper antiseptics. Broken bones might heal crooked, leaving warriors permanently disabled. Internal injuries were almost always fatal because there was no way to treat them effectively. The famous Spartan endurance wasn't just about toughness. It was about learning to function while in constant physical discomfort. Spartan warriors fought battles while suffering from infected wounds, broken ribs, twisted joints, and chronic pain from old injuries. They marched hundreds of miles on feet that were raw and bleeding. They wore armor that rubbed their skin raw and created pressure sores that never had time to heal. The seasonal nature of ancient warfare meant that this suffering was cyclical but predictable. Every spring, as the weather improved and the mountain passes cleared, armies would begin to mobilize. Every Spartan warrior knew that summer would bring new campaigns, new battles, new opportunities to die or kill. There was no retirement from this cycle, no age at which you were considered too old to fight. You continued until you were killed, disabled, or became so obviously decrepit that you were more liability than asset. The economic impact of constant warfare was devastating to individuals even within Sparta's unusual system. Warriors who were injured and couldn't fight lost their status and often their means of survival. There was no pension system, no veterans' benefits, no social safety net for those who had given everything to the state. You were valuable only as long as you could hold a spear and march in formation. Family relationships suffered terribly under this system. Spartan warriors saw their children only briefly before those children were taken for training. They had limited contact with their wives, and those relationships were often strained by the emotional damage that combat had inflicted. Many warriors became incapable of normal human affection. They had been so thoroughly trained to suppress their emotions that they couldn't access them even when they wanted to. The constant threat of death created a strange relationship with the future. Spartan warriors couldn't plan for old age because they didn't expect to live that long. They couldn't invest in relationships because those relationships might be severed at any moment by death in battle. They lived in a perpetual present tense, focused only on the next fight, the next campaign, the next opportunity to prove their worth or die trying. This psychological state was reinforced by Spartan religious beliefs, which emphasized the glory of death in battle and the shame of surviving defeat. Warriors were taught that dying for Sparta was the highest achievement possible, that survival was less important than maintaining honor. This created a death cult mentality where life itself was viewed as less valuable than reputation. The irony is that this system, designed to create perfect warriors, actually created men who were psychologically damaged in ways that made them less effective soldiers in many situations. They were excellent in the specific type of combat they had trained for, but they struggled to adapt to new tactics or unexpected situations. Their emotional suppression made it difficult for them to make quick decisions based on intuition or to inspire genuine loyalty in allies. The famous discipline of Spartan armies was really a form of collective trauma response. These men had been so thoroughly broken and rebuilt that they could only function within the rigid structure they had been trained for. Take away that structure, and many of them simply couldn't cope. This is why Spartan armies, while formidable in traditional battles, often struggled when faced with unconventional tactics or prolonged campaigns that required flexibility and adaptation. The mythology that grew up around Sparta has obscured these realities for thousands of years. We remember the 300 at Thermopylae as heroes who died gloriously for freedom. But the reality is that those men died because they had been so thoroughly conditioned that they literally could not conceive of any alternative. They weren't heroes making a conscious choice. They were the products of a system so brutal that death in battle seemed preferable to life in any other form. This is what it really meant to be a Spartan warrior. Not glory, not honor, not heroism, but a lifetime of systematic brutalization that created men who were barely human. They were effective killing machines. But the price paid for that effectiveness was everything that makes life worth living. And the true horror is that this wasn't an accident or an unfortunate side effect. It was the deliberate, calculated result of a society that had decided that military effectiveness was more important than human dignity, individual freedom, or even basic happiness. The system worked in its own terrible way. Spartan armies were feared throughout the ancient world. But the men who made up those armies paid a price so high that victory itself became a form of defeat. They won their battles, but they lost their souls. And in the end, that loss was so complete that even their victories couldn't save them from the ultimate collapse that awaited their entire civilization. The collapse wasn't sudden. Empires rarely die in a single dramatic moment, despite what the history books might suggest. Instead, they rot from within, slowly and quietly, until one day the facade can no longer hold, and everything crumbles at once. For Sparta, that rot had been spreading for generations, invisible to those who lived within the system, but obvious to anyone willing to look closely at what their society had become. The first cracks appeared in the very foundation that Sparta claimed made them strong: their population. The brutal selection process that killed weak infants, the agoge that broke so many boys, the constant warfare that claimed the lives of grown men, all of this had an inevitable mathematical result. There simply weren't enough Spartans left to maintain their way of life. By the 4th century BCE, the number of full Spartan citizens had dropped catastrophically. What had once been a population of perhaps 8,000 or 9,000 adult male warriors had dwindled to fewer than 1,000. This wasn't just a military problem, though that was certainly part of it. It was an existential crisis that threatened the very survival of their society. The irony was devastating. Sparta had created the most effective military system in the ancient world, but that same system was slowly killing them. Every battle won came at a cost they could no longer afford. Every generation of warriors produced fewer survivors than the last. The machine they had built to create perfect soldiers was consuming itself, one life at a time. But the numerical decline was only part of the problem. The quality of Spartan warriors was also deteriorating, though few were willing to admit it. The agoge that had once produced legendary fighters was producing men who were technically skilled, but psychologically hollow. They knew how to fight, but they had forgotten why fighting mattered. They could follow orders perfectly, but they couldn't think for themselves when those orders proved inadequate. This became apparent in their later military campaigns, where Spartan armies began suffering defeats that would have been unthinkable in their golden age. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, a Theban army decisively defeated what was supposed to be an invincible Spartan force. The Spartans fought with their usual discipline and courage, but they couldn't adapt to new tactics. They had become so rigid in their training that they couldn't respond effectively when faced with innovative strategies. The psychological damage that generations of brutal conditioning had inflicted was finally showing its true cost. These weren't the flexible, creative warriors that had made Sparta great. They were broken men who could only function within the narrow parameters they had been taught. When the world changed around them, they couldn't change with it. The Helot system, which had always been a source of vulnerability, became an active threat as Sparta's military strength declined. For centuries, the Spartans had maintained control over their enslaved population through sheer terror. But terror only works when those doing the terrorizing are strong enough to back up their threats. As Spartan numbers dwindled and their military reputations suffered, the Helots began to sense opportunity. Helot revolts became more frequent and more successful. What had once been easily crushed uprisings became serious military challenges that drained Spartan resources and manpower. The very people who had been forced to support Spartan society were now actively working to destroy it. And the Spartans, for all their military training, found themselves poorly equipped to deal with guerrilla warfare and popular resistance. The economic consequences were devastating. Sparta had never developed a productive economy because they had always relied on Helot labor. They had forbidden their citizens from engaging in trade or commerce, viewing such activities as beneath the dignity of warriors. But this meant that when the Helot system began to break down, they had no alternative source of wealth or productivity. Other Greek cities had adapted to changing circumstances by developing new technologies, expanding trade networks, and creating more flexible political systems. Sparta had remained deliberately static, convinced that their ancient ways were superior to any innovation. They had mistaken rigidity for strength, and that mistake was now destroying them. The social fabric of Spartan society was also unraveling. The bonds that had once held their warrior culture together were weakening as the contradictions inherent in their system became impossible to ignore. Men who had been trained from childhood to suppress their emotions and view other humans as tools were finding it increasingly difficult to maintain the minimal social connections necessary for any society to function. Families were falling apart as fathers who had never learned to show affection found themselves unable to connect with sons who were equally damaged. Marriages became mere breeding arrangements with no emotional content, producing children who were even more psychologically damaged than their parents. The cycle of brutalization was intensifying with each generation, creating people who were less and less capable of normal human relationships. The famous Spartan women, who had once been praised for their strength and independence, were also suffering under the weight of a system that had never really valued them as human beings. They had been told they were privileged compared to women in other Greek cities. But that privilege had always been conditional on their willingness to sacrifice their own children to the state's military needs. As the system began to fail, that sacrifice looked increasingly meaningless. Many Spartan women began to question why they should continue to produce children for a society that would systematically destroy those children's humanity. Birth rates among Spartan citizens continued to decline, not just because of military casualties, but because potential parents were unconsciously rebelling against a system that turned reproduction into a form of child sacrifice. The religious foundations of Spartan society were also crumbling. Their gods had always demanded sacrifice and obedience, but those demands had been justified by success in battle and prosperity at home. When both began to fail, the religious system lost its credibility. Warriors who had been taught that dying gloriously in battle was the highest achievement found themselves questioning that teaching. when their deaths accomplished nothing meaningful. The famous Spartan stoicism, which had once been a source of strength, became a kind of spiritual death. These were men who had been trained so thoroughly to suppress their emotions that they could no longer access the full range of human experience. They couldn't feel joy, love, wonder, or hope in any genuine way. They existed in a kind of emotional wasteland, going through the motions of life without ever really living. This psychological emptiness made them increasingly ineffective, not just as human beings, but as soldiers. Military effectiveness requires more than just technical skill and discipline. It requires the ability to inspire others, to adapt to changing circumstances, to maintain morale in the face of setbacks. The Spartan conditioning had eliminated these qualities, along with everything else that made men human. Their allies began to abandon them, not out of cowardice, but out of recognition that the Spartans were no longer the formidable partners they had once been. Other Greek cities had watched Spartan society with a mixture of admiration and horror for generations. Now the horror was winning out, and the admiration was fading as Spartan military failures mounted. The broader Greek world was also changing in ways that made Sparta's rigid system increasingly obsolete. New military technologies were emerging that required different kinds of soldiers. Economic systems were becoming more complex, demanding flexibility and innovation. Political structures were evolving to address the needs of more diverse populations. Sparta remained frozen in an ancient pattern that no longer served any useful purpose. Individual Spartans began to recognize the futility of their situation, though few could articulate it clearly. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to accept their system without question that they lacked the intellectual tools to analyze what was wrong with it. They could see that things weren't working, but they couldn't understand why or imagine alternatives. Some tried to reform the system, but reform was nearly impossible when the system itself was designed to resist change. The Agoge continued to produce broken men because that was what it was designed to do. The social structure continued to prioritize military effectiveness over human welfare because that was its fundamental purpose. The economic system continued to rely on helot labor because Spartans had never learned to do productive work themselves. The few Spartans who managed to break free from the system's psychological conditioning often found themselves unable to function in the wider world. They had been so thoroughly trained for one specific way of life that they couldn't adapt to anything else. They were like machines designed for a single purpose, useless when that purpose no longer existed. The final collapse, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. There was no dramatic last stand, no glorious final battle. Sparta simply faded into irrelevance, its population too small and too damaged to maintain the institutions that had once made it feared throughout the ancient world. The last true Spartans died not in heroic combat, but in quiet obscurity, victims of a system that had consumed everything human about them in pursuit of an ideal that had never been worth achieving. The Helots, who had suffered under Spartan rule for centuries, were finally free to build lives of their own. Ironically, many of them proved more capable of adaptation and growth than their former masters. They had retained their humanity despite generations of oppression, while the Spartans had lost theirs in pursuit of inhuman perfection. The lands that had once been Sparta were eventually absorbed by other powers, their strategic value recognized, but their social system abandoned as the historical curiosity it had always been. The ruins of their cities became tourist attractions for Romans, who came to gawk at the remnants of a civilization that had deliberately chosen brutality over humanity. Modern scholars would later debate whether Sparta had ever really been as effective as its reputation suggested. Some argued that their military success had been largely mythological, that their enemies had been weaker than supposed, that their victories had been the result of favorable circumstances rather than superior training. Others maintained that their effectiveness had been real, but that the cost had been so high as to make their achievements meaningless. What cannot be debated is the human cost of the Spartan experiment. Hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps millions over the centuries, had their lives destroyed by a system that treated human beings as raw materials to be processed into weapons. Children were murdered for showing weakness. Boys were systematically brutalized to eliminate their capacity for independent thought. Men lived and died as components in a machine that served no purpose beyond its own perpetuation. The women of Sparta suffered their own particular torments, praised for a strength that was really just another form of slavery, honored for sacrifices that served no meaningful purpose. They were told they were privileged, while being denied every aspect of human experience that makes life worth living. Even the helots, who were at the bottom of Spartan society, were victims of a system that could only maintain itself through constant violence and oppression. Their labor supported a warrior class that produced nothing of value. Their lives were held hostage to the paranoid fears of their masters, and their children grew up knowing that they could be killed at any moment for showing too much intelligence or independence. The Spartan system had promised to create perfect warriors, but it had created only perfect victims, victims of an ideology that confused cruelty with strength, brutality with courage, and dehumanization with discipline. They had built a society that was supposed to last forever, but it had contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction from the very beginning. The true tragedy of Sparta wasn't its military defeats or its eventual disappearance from history. The tragedy was that so many human lives were wasted in service of an ideal that was fundamentally hollow. All that suffering, all that sacrifice, all that carefully orchestrated brutality had produced nothing of lasting value. No great art, no profound philosophy, no technological innovations, no social progress that might have justified even a fraction of the human cost. They had taken the miracle of human consciousness, the extraordinary gift of intelligence and emotion and creativity that makes our species unique, and they had systematically destroyed it in generation after generation of their own people. They had looked at the full spectrum of human potential and decided that only the capacity for violence was worth preserving. This is why it truly sucked to be a Spartan warrior. Not because the training was hard or because the battles were dangerous, but because the entire system was designed to rob you of everything that makes life meaningful. You weren't a hero serving a glorious cause. You weren't a defender of freedom or justice or any noble ideal. You were a victim of a social experiment that had decided your humanity was an acceptable price to pay for military effectiveness. And in the end, even that effectiveness proved to be temporary. The perfect warriors couldn't save themselves from the inevitable consequences of their own perfection. The system that had promised to make them invincible had made them extinct instead. The Spartan experiment stands as one of history's clearest examples of how a society can become so obsessed with a single goal that it destroys everything else worth preserving. It shows us what happens when efficiency becomes more important than humanity, when order becomes more valuable than freedom, when the means become so extreme that they make the ends meaningless. For the individual Spartan warrior, trapped within this system from birth to death, there was no escape and no redemption. Only the slow realization that everything he had been taught to value was worthless, and everything he had been taught to despise might have been worth preserving after all. But by then, it was too late. The machine had already done its work, and there was nothing left to save. The end came, not with trumpets or glory, but with the quiet desperation of men who had finally begun to see what they had become. In the final centuries of Spartan power, something shifted in the eyes of their warriors. The absolute certainty that had once defined them began to crack, revealing glimpses of the humanity that had been buried so deep they had forgotten it existed. You have to understand, these men had been conditioned never to question, never to doubt, never to look inward. But as their world crumbled around them, some began to experience something their training had never prepared them for: self-awareness. And with that awareness came a horror so profound that many preferred the old blindness, Imagine spending your entire life believing you were part of something glorious, something necessary, something that justified every sacrifice you had made and every atrocity you had committed. Then slowly, gradually, you begin to realize that it was all meaningless, that the children who died in selection were murdered for nothing, that the boys who broke under the agog suffered for no purpose, that the helots you hunted and killed were human beings whose only crime was existing in a system that needed victims. Some Spartans began to experience what we might recognize today as a crisis of conscience. They would wake in the night, not from nightmares of battle, but from dreams of the children they might have been before the system took them. They would find themselves staring at their own hands and wondering how many lives those hands had taken, how much suffering they had caused, all in service of ideals that had never been worthy of the sacrifice. These men had no framework for processing such realizations. They had been trained to suppress introspection as weakness, to dismiss moral questioning as softness. They had no philosophers to guide them, no counselors to help them understand what they were feeling, no religious tradition that offered forgiveness or redemption. They were alone with their growing awareness, trapped in minds that had been deliberately crippled to prevent exactly this kind of thinking. The psychological torment was excruciating. They began to understand that they were not heroes but victims, not protectors but destroyers, not the pinnacle of human achievement but the result of systematic dehumanization. And yet they were still trapped within the system that had created them, still forced to play their roles, still expected to maintain the facade that everything was as it should be. Some sought escape in madness. They retreated into fantasy worlds where their actions had meaning, where their sacrifices served noble purposes, where the pain they had endured and inflicted was justified by some greater good. Others sought escape in death, not the glorious death in battle they had been promised, but quiet suicides carried out in shame and desperation. A few tried to break free entirely, abandoning Sparta to seek new lives in other cities. But they found themselves strangers in a world they had never been allowed to understand. They spoke the same language as other Greeks, but they could not comprehend the concepts of individual choice, personal happiness, or emotional fulfillment. They were like men who had been blind from birth, suddenly given sight, overwhelmed by a reality too complex and alien for their damaged minds to process. The women of Sparta faced their own particular awakening. For generations, they had been told that their strength came from their willingness to sacrifice their children for the state. They had been praised for sending sons to die, for celebrating deaths that might have broken mothers in other cities. But as the system collapsed and those deaths proved meaningless, many began to recognize the monstrous nature of what they had been asked to embrace. The guilt was overwhelming. These women realized they had been accomplices in the destruction of their own children, that their pride in Spartan motherhood had been a form of psychological abuse so sophisticated they had never recognized it as such. They had been taught to suppress their maternal instincts, to view love as weakness, to celebrate the very system that guaranteed their children would never know happiness or peace. Many Spartan women in those final generations simply stopped having children, not from any conscious political decision, but from a deep, instinctive recognition that bringing new life into such a system was an act of cruelty. The birth rate plummeted not just because of war casualties, but because potential mothers could no longer bear the thought of watching their children go through what they themselves had endured. The helots, meanwhile, were experiencing their own awakening. For centuries, they had been kept compliant through terror and systematic brutalization. But as Spartan power weakened, they began to recognize that their oppressors were not superhuman warriors, but broken men clinging to a system that no longer served any rational purpose. The mystique of Spartan invincibility faded, replaced by a clearer understanding of what Sparta really was. A society built on fear, maintained through violence, and ultimately doomed by its own contradictions. The Helot revolts that characterized Sparta's final period were not just military campaigns, but expressions of moral outrage. These enslaved people had watched generations of their children murdered, their families destroyed, their communities terrorized, all to support a warrior class that produced nothing of value. When they finally had the strength to resist, their anger was not just political, but deeply personal. They fought not just for freedom, but for justice, for recognition of their humanity, for acknowledgement of the crimes that had been committed against them. And in their resistance, they demonstrated qualities that Spartan society had systematically tried to destroy. Compassion for each other, loyalty based on love rather than fear, courage rooted in moral conviction rather than conditioning. The contrast was devastating for those Spartans capable of seeing it. Here were people they had been taught to view as subhuman, displaying virtues that Spartan culture claimed to embody, but had actually eliminated from its own population. The Helots fought for their families, their freedom, their right to live as human beings. The Spartans fought only because fighting was all they knew how to do. In the final battles between Spartans and Helots, observers noted something that would have been unthinkable in earlier eras. Some Spartans simply gave up, not from cowardice, but from a kind of spiritual exhaustion. They could no longer find meaning in the violence that had once defined their existence. They could no longer pretend that their cause was just or their sacrifices meaningful. These men would drop their weapons and walk away from battles, not to save their lives, but because they could no longer bear to take the lives of others. They had reached a point where the conditioning that had sustained them for so long finally broke down, leaving them face to face with the reality of what they had become and what they had done. The Spartan military system, which had seemed so perfect in its brutal efficiency, proved incapable of dealing with this crisis of conscience. It had no mechanisms for addressing moral doubt, no procedures for handling warriors who questioned their orders, no way to maintain discipline among men who no longer believed in their cause. The famous Spartan discipline began to crumble as individual warriors started making their own moral choices. Some refused to participate in the Krypteia, the ritual murder of Helots. Others began treating prisoners with mercy, violating centuries of military tradition. Still others simply deserted, abandoning their posts to seek some form of redemption or peace. The commanders, themselves products of the same system, had no idea how to respond. They had been trained to deal with external enemies, not with internal moral collapse. They tried to maintain order through increased brutality, executing deserters and punishing any sign of independent thought. But this only accelerated the breakdown. As more warriors recognized the fundamental injustice of the system they served, the irony was profound. The very qualities that Sparta had tried to eliminate, compassion, individual conscience, moral reasoning, were the ones that might have saved them. But by systematically destroying these human capacities in their own population, they had made adaptation and reform impossible. They had created a society incapable of learning from its mistakes or changing course when change became necessary. The philosophical implications were staggering, though few Spartans were equipped to understand them. They had built their entire civilization on the premise that human nature was something to be overcome, that natural emotions and instincts were obstacles to perfection. But in the end, it was the denial of human nature that destroyed them, not the acceptance of it. Other Greek philosophers would later write about the Spartan collapse as a cautionary tale about the dangers of extremism. They recognized that Sparta's fate demonstrated the futility of trying to perfect humanity by eliminating its humanity. The Spartans had tried to create a society of gods, and had created instead a society of ghosts. The economic collapse that accompanied this moral breakdown was swift and total. A society that had never learned to produce anything of value could not sustain itself once its military power faded. The Spartans had spent so many generations focused on destruction that they had forgotten how to create. They could tear down, but they could not build up. They could take life, but they could not nurture it. The agricultural system, dependent entirely on helot labor, fell apart as those enslaved workers either rebelled or simply walked away. The Spartans, forbidden by their own traditions from doing manual labor, found themselves helpless to maintain even basic food production. They had created a warrior class so specialized that it was incapable of the most basic tasks of survival. Trade networks collapsed as other cities recognized that Sparta had nothing to offer except violence, and violence was no longer something they could deliver effectively. The Spartans had no crafts, no industries, no intellectual traditions that might have sustained them through military defeat. They had put all their eggs in one basket, and when that basket broke, they had nothing left. The cultural decay was even more complete than the economic collapse. Generations of deliberately limiting intellectual development had left the Spartans with no literature, no art, no music, no philosophical traditions that might have provided comfort or guidance during their crisis. They had stories of military glory, but those stories had become sources of shame rather than pride. They had religious traditions, but those traditions offered only demands for sacrifice, not solace for suffering. The Spartan language itself began to change as the society collapsed. Words that had once carried positive connotations, like discipline and sacrifice, became associated with suffering and futility. The famous Spartan brevity in speech, once seen as a sign of wisdom and strength, revealed itself as a symptom of intellectual impoverishment. They had so few ideas worth expressing that they needed few words to express them. Young Spartans in the final generations began to show signs of what we might recognize as cultural dissociation. They went through the motions of their training and rituals, but without any real belief in their purpose or value. They were like actors performing in a play whose plot had been forgotten, speaking lines that no longer had meaning to an audience that had stopped caring. The agog continued to operate even as the society it was meant to serve fell apart around it. Boys were still taken from their families, still subjected to brutal conditioning, still trained to become perfect warriors for a state that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. But the process had become purely mechanical, a tradition maintained not because it served any purpose, but because stopping it would require acknowledging that it had all been pointless. These final generations of Spartan warriors were perhaps the most tragic figures in the entire history of the civilization. They were the products of a system that no longer had any reason to exist, trained for a role that no longer needed to be filled, conditioned to serve ideals that had been revealed as hollow. They were living fossils, the last remnants of an evolutionary dead end. Many of these young men simply refused to complete their training. They would run away from the agog, flee to other cities, or simply disappear into the countryside. The Spartan authorities lacked the resources to track them all down, and increasingly lacked the will to try. The system was consuming itself, and everyone involved could see that it was doomed. Those who did complete their training found themselves warriors without wars, guardians without anything worth guarding, protectors of a society that was no longer worth protecting. They wandered through the ruins of their civilization like ghosts, going through the motions of lives that had lost all meaning and purpose. The women watched this collapse with a mixture of grief and relief. Grief for the waste of so many lives, relief that the cycle of brutalization might finally be ending. Some tried to preserve what little remained of human connection in their families, attempting to show their children the love and affection that Spartan tradition had forbidden. But the damage was often too deep, the conditioning too complete, for such efforts to succeed. The final Spartans died not in glorious battle, but in quiet despair, victims of a system that had promised them immortal glory, but delivered only mortal suffering. They had been told they were the pinnacle of human achievement, and they died knowing they were examples of human failure. They had been promised that their sacrifices would create something eternal, and they watched that something crumble into dust during their own lifetimes. The last true Spartan warrior probably died alone, in poverty and obscurity, mourning not just his own fate, but the fate of all those who had come before him. He would have understood, finally, that the system had not made them strong, but had made them weak, had not elevated them, but had diminished them, had not given their lives meaning, but had stripped all meaning away. And in that understanding, in that moment of final clarity, he would have experienced something that his training had tried to eliminate, but could never completely destroy: his own humanity. The recognition that he was not a weapon or a tool, or a component in a machine, but a human being who had been denied the chance to live as one. The tragedy of Sparta was not that they failed to achieve their goals. The tragedy was that their goals were never worth achieving in the first place. They had sacrificed everything that makes life valuable in pursuit of something that was ultimately valueless. They had traded their souls for temporary power, and in the end, they lost both. This is the final truth about what it meant to be a Spartan warrior. You were not a hero in an epic tale, but a victim in a tragedy. You were not the culmination of human potential, but an example of how that potential could be systematically destroyed. You were not proof of what humans could become, but a warning about what they should never allow themselves to become. The silence that follows the end of such a story is not peaceful. It is the silence of waste, of opportunities lost forever, of lives that could have been lived differently. It is the silence of recognition that all that suffering served no purpose, that all those sacrifices brought nothing of value, that all that pain was inflicted and endured for no reason at all. And perhaps that is the most terrible thing about the Spartan system. Not that it was cruel, but that its cruelty was pointless. Not that it demanded sacrifice, but that the sacrifice was meaningless. Not that it destroyed lives, but that it destroyed them for nothing. In the end, to be a Spartan warrior was to be the victim of humanity's capacity for self-deception, a living example of how noble ideals can be corrupted into instruments of oppression, how the pursuit of perfection can become a form of self-destruction, and how the desire to transcend human limitations can lead instead to the abandonment of everything that makes humans worth transcending in the first place. The lesson of Sparta echoes across the centuries, a warning whispered in the ruins of their civilization. Beware of those who promise to make you more than human, for they will certainly make you less. The price of their perfection is your humanity, and once paid, it can never be refunded. And with that understanding, we can finally let the last Spartan warrior rest. His suffering is over. His story is told. And perhaps, in the telling, we can ensure that such suffering never happens again. The silence that settled over Sparta wasn't the silence of peace. It was something heavier, more profound. The silence of a civilization that had finally exhausted itself, like a fire that had burned so hot for so long that it had consumed not just its fuel, but the very air needed to sustain it. And in that silence, scattered across the ancient world, were the remnants of what had once been the most feared warriors in human history. These final survivors carried with them something that no amount of training could have prepared them for: the weight of understanding. They had lived long enough to see through the lies their society had told them, and themselves. They had watched their world collapse, not from external conquest, but from the slow recognition that everything they had believed in was hollow. Imagine meeting one of these men in the years after Sparta's fall. You might encounter him in a tavern in Athens, sitting alone in a corner, his scarred hands wrapped around a cup of wine. He would be middle-aged, perhaps, with the bearing of someone who had once been a soldier, but the eyes of someone who had seen too much. If you approached him, if you somehow gained his trust enough for him to speak, what stories might he tell? He might talk about his childhood, those first 7 years before the Agog claimed him. Fragments of memory that had somehow survived the systematic erasure of his humanity. A mother's lullaby, perhaps, or the warmth of a hand stroking his hair. Simple moments of tenderness that had been buried so deep under layers of conditioning that he had forgotten they existed until everything else fell away. He might describe the moment when he first began to question what he had been taught. Perhaps it came during one of the cryptia, when he was ordered to murder a helot child who had shown signs of intelligence. He had been trained to see such killing as necessary, even virtuous, but something in the child's eyes, some spark of curiosity or fear that reminded him of his own forgotten childhood, had made him hesitate. Just for a moment. Just long enough to remember that the thing he was about to kill was human. Or maybe the awakening came later, during a battle where he watched his fellow warriors die not for glory or honor, but simply because they were too psychologically damaged to adapt to changing tactics. He had seen men who could endure any physical torture break completely when faced with the need to make an independent decision. Warriors who had been trained to perfection in following orders, but who had no idea how to think for themselves when those orders proved inadequate. The stories these survivors might tell would not be tales of heroism. They would be confessions, attempts to process experiences so traumatic that they defied normal understanding. They would speak of watching their own children taken for the agog, knowing exactly what horrors awaited them, but being powerless to intervene. They would describe the slow realization that they had become the very monsters they had been taught to fight. Some had tried to save others, to warn young men about what awaited them in the system. But their efforts were usually futile. The conditioning was too strong, the social pressure too intense. Boys who might have escaped the worst of it instead walked willingly into destruction because they had been taught that destruction was glorious. These survivors would tell you about the nightmares that haunted them, not just memories of battles fought, but visions of battles that need never have been fought at all. They dreamed of the lives that might have been lived if Sparta had chosen a different path, if they had valued creation over destruction, love over dominance, wisdom over mere obedience. They might describe the peculiar torture of living with skills that had no purpose in a peaceful world. Their hands knew how to kill with dozens of different weapons, but they had never learned to build anything, to craft anything, to nurture anything into growth. They were masters of destruction in a world that needed builders. The psychological damage went deeper than most people could comprehend. These men had been conditioned from childhood to view emotion as weakness, relationships as liabilities, and individual thought as treason. Trying to function in normal society was like asking someone who had been blind from birth to suddenly navigate by sight. They lacked the basic emotional vocabulary that other people took for granted. Many struggled with what we might recognize today as severe depression, though they had no name for it and no understanding of what was happening to them. They had been trained to suppress their feelings so completely that they could no longer access them even when they wanted to. They lived in a kind of emotional wasteland, cut off from the full spectrum of human experience. Others experienced what seemed like the opposite problem, but was really just another symptom of the same damage. Their suppressed emotions would occasionally break through their conditioning in explosive, uncontrollable outbursts. They might find themselves weeping for hours over a dead bird, or flying into murderous rages over trivial slights. Their emotional regulation had been so thoroughly destroyed that they swung between numbness and overwhelming intensity with no middle ground. The survivors who had managed to marry and have children face perhaps the cruelest irony of all. They desperately wanted to love their families, to give them the affection and care that had been denied to them. But they literally didn't know how. They had no models for healthy relationships, no understanding of how to express tenderness or provide emotional support. They were like men trying to speak a language they had never learned. Some tried to compensate by being as different from Spartan fathers as possible. They would shower their children with gifts, refuse to discipline them at all, or try to protect them from every possible hardship. But these efforts often backfired, creating different kinds of problems. Children need structure and guidance, and these damaged men often had no idea how to provide appropriate boundaries without reverting to the brutal methods they had experienced themselves. Others went in the opposite direction, unconsciously replicating the patterns they had learned despite their conscious desire to do better. They would find themselves being harsh with their children, demanding perfection, showing disappointment at any sign of weakness. The conditioning ran so deep that it emerged even when they were trying their hardest to fight it. The wives and children of these survivors often suffered in ways that were invisible to outsiders. Living with someone so psychologically damaged was exhausting and heartbreaking. These women had married men who looked normal on the surface, but who were fundamentally broken in ways that made genuine intimacy nearly impossible. They found themselves living with strangers who happened to share their beds. The economic struggles were equally devastating. These men had been trained for one thing only: warfare in the specific Spartan style, but that style of warfare was becoming obsolete. And even if it hadn't been, there was little demand for their services. Who would hire a mercenary who might break down psychologically at any moment, who had no understanding of loyalty beyond blind obedience, who had been conditioned to see everyone outside their immediate unit as potential enemies? Many ended up doing manual labor, the very work that Spartan society had taught them to despise. They might find themselves digging ditches or hauling cargo, their hands that had once wielded spears and swords now blistered from the handles of shovels and ropes. The humiliation was profound, not because such work was inherently shameful, but because they had been conditioned to see it as beneath their dignity. Others turned to drink, seeking in wine what they could no longer find in human connection. Alcohol provided temporary relief from the constant psychological pain, but it also loosened the iron control they had learned to maintain over their emotions. Drunk Spartan veterans were dangerous, not because they became violent, though some did, but because they became vulnerable. They would break down completely, weeping and raging about things they couldn't even articulate clearly. The religious crisis many experienced was particularly acute. They had been taught that their gods demanded sacrifice and absolute obedience, that dying in battle was the highest form of worship. But when their society collapsed, and their sacrifices proved meaningless, what did that say about their gods? Either their deities had abandoned them, or their understanding of divine will had been completely wrong from the beginning. Some tried to find solace in other religious traditions, but this rarely worked. Their conditioning had been so specific, so tied to Spartan religious practices, that they couldn't adapt to different forms of worship. They were like instruments tuned to play only one song, incapable of producing different melodies, even when they desperately wanted to. The few who managed to find some measure of peace usually did so by dedicating themselves to preventing others from experiencing what they had endured. They might become teachers, not of warfare, but of compassion. They might work with orphaned children, trying to provide the care and guidance they had never received. They might speak out against systems of brutalization, using their own experiences as warnings. But even these efforts were complicated by their damaged psychology. They often lacked the emotional skills necessary to be effective teachers or caregivers. Their attempts to help others were sometimes clumsy or even harmful, despite their good intentions. They were like doctors trying to heal others while suffering from diseases they didn't understand themselves. The most tragic figures among the survivors were those who never managed to break free from their conditioning at all. They continued to believe, despite all evidence to the contrary, that Sparta's way had been right and that their current suffering was the result of weakness or betrayal. They spent their remaining years trying to recreate the system that had destroyed them, usually on a smaller scale, with their own families or any young men they could influence. These unreformed survivors were often the most dangerous individuals in their communities. They were convinced that the solution to their problems was more discipline, more brutality, more systematic elimination of human weakness. They had learned nothing from their experiences except that the system hadn't been harsh enough, that the conditioning hadn't gone deep enough, that more humanity needed to be stripped away. They might establish small schools or training programs attempting to create mini versions of the Goge. They would attract students by promising to make them strong, to prepare them for a harsh world, to teach them self-discipline and courage. But what they actually taught was self-hatred, emotional suppression, and the systematic destruction of everything that made life worth living. The communities where these unreformed survivors settled often noticed strange patterns: higher rates of suicide among young men, unusual numbers of family breakdowns, children who seemed mature beyond their years, but who lacked normal emotional responses. The poison of Spartan conditioning continued to spread, diluted, but still toxic. Even worse were the survivors who became convinced that they could perfect the Spartan system, that they had identified the flaws that led to its collapse and could correct them. They would write treatises on military training, design new forms of conditioning, or seek positions of influence where they could implement their improved versions of systematic brutalization. These men were perhaps the most dangerous of all because they combined the psychological damage of their original conditioning with the intellectual arrogance of believing they could do better. They had learned just enough from Sparta's failure to make their own systems more sophisticated, but not enough to recognize that the fundamental premise was wrong. The children and grandchildren of Spartan survivors often carried the damage forward in subtle ways. Even when their fathers or grandfathers had tried to break the cycle, the psychological patterns persisted. These descendants might show unusual difficulty with emotional expression, problems forming close relationships, or a tendency toward rigid thinking that they couldn't explain or overcome. The trauma had been so severe, so systematic, that it left marks that persisted for generations. Like a genetic mutation that weakened every subsequent generation, the Spartan conditioning continued to influence families long after the original victims had died. Some scholars who studied these survivors noted that they seemed to age differently from other men. Not physically, necessarily, though many did show the effects of the brutal training they had endured. But psych conditioning had been completed. They might live, graduated from the agurge, this psychological stun, to be 70 or 80, but emotionally, they remained 20-year-olds, who had justologically, they seemed frozen at the age when their ting made it nearly impossible for them to develop the wisdom that normally comes with age. They couldn't learn from their experiences in the way that healthy individuals do, because their capacity for reflection and growth had been systematically destroyed. They were trapped in an eternal present, unable to move forward or integrate their past experiences into a coherent understanding of life. The few who managed to achieve some measure of psychological healing usually did so only after years or decades of struggle. The process was slow and painful, requiring them to essentially rebuild their personalities from scratch. They had to learn how to feel emotions without being overwhelmed by them, how to form relationships without seeing others as threats or tools, how to make decisions based on their own judgment, rather than blindly following orders. This healing process was made more difficult by the fact that there was no roadmap for it. No one had ever tried to rehabilitate individuals who had been so thoroughly conditioned from childhood. These survivors had to figure out how to become human again through trial and error, often making mistakes that hurt themselves and others in the process. Some found help from philosophers or physicians who were willing to work with them, but most had to struggle alone. They were pioneers in a strange new territory, explorers of their own damaged psyches, trying to map a path back to something resembling normal human experience. The process often involved a kind of grieving for the person they might have been if they had been allowed to develop naturally. They had to mourn not just for the childhood they had lost, but for the entire alternative life that had been stolen from them. They grieved for relationships they had never been able to form, for children they had damaged through their own conditioning, for opportunities they had missed because they had been trained to see only one path forward. Even those who achieved the most complete healing never fully recovered. They might learn to love and be loved, to create rather than destroy, to find joy in simple pleasures. But they always carried within them the knowledge of what humans were capable of doing to each other when ideology became more important than humanity. They became living reminders of the price of extremism, walking cautionary tales about the dangers of sacrificing individual dignity for collective goals. Their very existence challenged the comfortable assumption that such systematic brutalization could only happen to other people in other times and places. The conversations these healed survivors had with their children and grandchildren were often profound and heartbreaking. They would try to explain what they had experienced without traumatizing the next generation, to pass on the lessons they had learned without passing on the damage they had suffered. These were men who had learned through the hardest possible experience that strength without compassion is weakness, that discipline without love is brutality, and that any system that treats human beings as raw materials to be processed will ultimately destroy itself along with its victims. Their words carried a weight that no theoretical discussion could match. They had lived inside the machine of dehumanization and had seen exactly how it worked, what it produced, and why it inevitably failed. Their testimony was not abstract philosophy, but lived experience, not academic theory, but hard-won wisdom paid for with decades of suffering. And as they aged and died, these survivors took with them irreplaceable knowledge about one of humanity's most extreme experiments in social engineering. They were the last witnesses to what it actually felt like to live inside such a system, the final voices that could speak from direct experience about the human cost of pursuing perfection through the elimination of humanity. Their deaths marked the end of an era, the closing of a chapter in human history that we can hope will never be repeated. But their stories remain, scattered through historical records and family memories, whispered warnings about paths that should never be taken again. These are the voices that speak to us across the centuries, reminding us that behind every system of brutalization are individual human beings who suffer its effects long after the system itself has collapsed. They remind us that the true measure of any society is not its military effectiveness or its ability to create perfect soldiers, but its capacity to nurture and protect the full range of human potential. And perhaps most importantly, they remind us that healing is possible even from the most severe psychological damage, that the human spirit, no matter how thoroughly it has been suppressed, retains the capacity to recover and grow, that love, compassion, and individual dignity are not luxuries to be sacrificed for practical goals, but necessities without which no society can truly survive. The last Spartan warriors died knowing these truths, and in their dying, they passed on the most valuable lesson their civilization had ever produced, that the price of inhuman perfection is always too high to pay. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ruins where Sparta once stood, illuminating broken stones that had witnessed the rise and fall of one of history's most brutal experiments in human engineering. And as we reach the end of this journey through time, perhaps it's worth asking ourselves what we've really learned from walking in the footsteps of these damaged men. We began this exploration expecting to find heroes, warriors whose strength and discipline had become the stuff of legend. Instead, we discovered something far more troubling and infinitely more human. We found victims of a system so sophisticated in its cruelty that it convinced its own casualties they were blessed, so thorough in its destruction that it made its survivors grateful for their suffering. The Spartan experiment wasn't unique because it was harsh. History is full of harsh societies, brutal training regimens, and demanding military cultures. What made Sparta different was the systematic nature of its dehumanization, the scientific precision with which it identified and eliminated every quality that might make life worth living. They didn't stumble into brutality through ignorance or desperation. They chose it deliberately, thoughtfully, as a rational response to their fears and insecurities. They looked at the full spectrum of human experience: joy, creativity, love, wonder, individual expression, and they decided that all of it was weakness that needed to be cut away. This is what makes their story so chilling and so relevant, because the impulse that drove Sparta still exists in our world today. The desire to create perfect people by eliminating their imperfections. The belief that human nature is a problem to be solved rather than a gift to be nurtured. The assumption that strength comes from suppression rather than integration. We see echoes of Spartan thinking in every ideology that promises to make us better by making us less, in every system that treats individual dignity as an obstacle to collective goals, in every institution that believes it can create excellence by destroying everything that doesn't fit its narrow definition of success. The men we followed through this story, from their first breath to their final understanding, were not born monsters. They were children who might have grown into poets or farmers or philosophers if they had been allowed to develop naturally. The capacity for creation, for love, for wonder existed within them, just as it exists within all of us. But that capacity was systematically identified and eliminated, not through accident or neglect, but through careful design. The Spartan Agog wasn't a failure of education. It was education working exactly as intended, producing exactly the results it was designed to achieve. And that's perhaps the most disturbing lesson of all, that human beings are malleable enough to be shaped into almost anything, including shapes that deny their own humanity. That with enough time, enough pressure, enough systematic conditioning, you can convince people that their own destruction is their salvation. The Spartans genuinely believed they were creating something noble and necessary. The mothers who sent their sons to die thought they were demonstrating strength. The warriors who murdered helot children believed they were protecting their society. The system worked so well that its victims became its most enthusiastic supporters. And so we come to the end of our journey through Sparta's darkness, where we've seen what happens when a society decides that humanity itself is the enemy. The true horror wasn't the battles or the brutality, but the quiet moments when these broken men realized they had traded everything meaningful for nothing lasting. Their story whispers across the centuries, reminding us that the greatest strength lies not in what we can endure, but in what we choose to preserve. Sleep well, knowing that their suffering was not in vain if we remember the lesson they paid so dearly to teach us.